Cornwall Iron Furnace, and I'm so excited to join you tonight. Thank you. So Cornwall Iron Furnace is a historic site which is owned and operated by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, Pennsylvania State Agency for History. Our lecture tonight, Colonial Cornwall, presented by Mike Weber, is brought to you by the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, a nonprofit support group that's made up of volunteers from the community. This talk is the first in our 2026 lecture series, which will feature special emphasis on topics related to the semi-quincentennial commemoration of America's 250th birthday. The lecture this evening will be a hybrid program consisting of people in the room here at Cornwall Manor and viewers at home watching on their computers. For those of you attending in person, we will gladly take your questions at the end of the presentation. For those of you on Zoom, please send your questions using the Q&A button, and we'll also address those questions at the end of the presentation. We are recording this evening's lecture, and we'll place it on the museum's YouTube channel in the near future. Cornwall Iron Furnace is very fortunate to present this annual lecture series free of charge through the generous support of our members and friends. Special thanks to Cornwall Manor for the use of the Freeman Hall and to everyone who supports the mission of Cornwall Iron Furnace through their generous gifts. If you enjoy our lectures, please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates in support of this program. A link to our online donation page will be dropped into the webinar chat. Thank you for considering a gift of support, and thank you for helping us continue our educational outreach and programming at Cornwall Iron Furnace. Now, it is my distinct privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Mr. Mike Weber. Mike is a popular returning speaker for the museum, and he has a long history with and a love of Cornwall. As a child, he collected rock and mineral specimens from in and around the mine's waste rock piles that led him to the study of geology. As a 1982 geoscience graduate from Penn State University, Mike worked for 36 years as a geologist, health physicist, and manager for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the U.S. Geological Survey. After retiring from federal service, he returned to Cornwall, where he serves as a guide and researches the history of mining and geology of Cornwall and similar deposits in Pennsylvania. Mike is a weekly volunteer at the museum and gives fabulous guided tours on Fridays. So you'll want to come and get a tour from him pretty soon here. He is also an author, and he has authored the book Always More Production for Us, which is a history of the mining operation at Cornwall. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for this evening, Mike Weber.
Well, thank you, Becky. It's always a pleasure for me to join you here. It's especially a pleasure to kick off this 2026 seminar series. We have already been doing some mini seminars over at the Furnace on Sundays. So if you're not aware of those, check them out. They're very much compressed, shortened presentations, but they cover a wide variety of topics. That should be of interest to the broader Cornwall community. I wanted to start by thanking the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates for giving me this opportunity to make a presentation on Colonial Cornwall. I'll also thank Becky Labar, who you've already met, the new site administrator for Cornwall Furnace, Lydia Jones, who's the museum educator, as well as Bruce Chadbourne, Kathy Donaldson, and Karen Mitchell, who are working behind the scenes to enable this Zoom hybrid presentation. And as Becky mentioned, we also thank Cornwall Manor for hosting us tonight. And we want to welcome those of us who are joining us here in person, as well as people who are joining us remotely from all over the world, potentially. So March is Women's History Month, if you've not heard about that. There's a fist. A good one. So it's my pleasure to work with Becky and also Lydia at the Furnace, two women who are focused on history, who are making history, preserving it, sharing it, and look forward to many years working with them in that capacity. So we have to begin this presentation tonight by celebrating the birthday of the United States of America. That will officially occur on July 4th, coincident with the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, it's important to recognize that Native Americans lived here for thousands of years before the continent was settled by Europeans. The colonial period in North America extended from 1564 until 1776. Some historians push that a little bit into the end of the Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris, but the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission establishes the end of the colonial period in 1776. And of course, during that period, there was this large influx of peoples from from Europe. Colonial Cornwall, in particular, existed in a subset of that entire period from 1734 until 1776. So that's the time frame that I'll be focusing on tonight. Now, this presentation, excuse me, is really a bit of a stage setter for the other talks that will occur throughout the course of the year. And so you'll see I'll be focusing on a broad range of topics related to colonial Cornwall, including the land, the people, the farms, the houses, the trees, how did people get around, what clothing did they wear, what food and drink did they consume. And then towards the latter part of my presentation, I'll specifically focus on Cornwall Furnace, Hopewell Forges, which were also built by Peter Grubb, and the mines, which provided the iron ore to support those, and then wrap up by talking about the workers here at Cornwall and end with the conclusion of the colonial period here in Cornwall in 1776. Now, this presentation is augmented by first-person observations of colonial Pennsylvania. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I am not that first person. I have not lived that long. But we'll, as I mentioned, also be talking about the overview of the Cornwall Furnace during this period, Hopewell Forges, and the Cornwall mines. And I hope, if nothing else, when you leave here tonight, you'll not only have a good orientation to what life may have been like in colonial Pennsylvania, specifically here in colonial Cornwall, and also perhaps know a little bit more about the history of Cornwall. If you attend the site and you walk through the exhibition and you take the tour, you'll hear a lot about Peter Grubb, the founder of the furnace. You'll hear about Robert Coleman and then the Coleman descendants that followed, but you don't really hear the whole story. So by attending these seminars, hopefully over time, you'll get that whole story, at least as we currently understand it. And research continues, so we continue to learn about the history here in Cornwall. So with that, let me start by talking about Cornwall. The land here at Cornwall began to be acquired by Peter Grubb in 1734. And that map, that little sketch you see on the right side of the screen, is a survey of a 200-acre plot that was warranted to Peter Grubb in 1734, subsequently surveyed, and then patented in 1744. So that initial acquisition of land by Peter Grubb marks the initial settlement of this area. And you're in fact living, or you're on that land right now. Not this particular plot, but other plots like it that Peter acquired. One of the first things that Peter did once he began acquiring the land was to demonstrate the suitability of the iron ore that was present in those three hills just next door, on Big Hill, Middle Hill, and Grassy Hill. And he did that by setting up a bloomery forge so he could test and show the suitability of that iron ore for making high quality iron. That was followed by the initial mining in 1737. And then, of course, there was the construction of both the furnace and the forges between 1739 and 1742. And the forges I'm referring to here are the Hopewell forges, which are located about 4 miles southeast of Cornwall on what is today known as Hammer Creek, right off of 322. Peter named Cornwall for his father's homeland in England, Cornwall, England, and thus Colonial Cornwall became established. So this is what the area looked like as best I could map it in 1745. Of course, we show in the middle of the map Cornwall Furnace with the one red square, and then the Hopewell Forges located on what is today off of Route 322. To the south of the map, you have a Colonial Lancaster, one of the biggest, if not the largest, inland towns that existed during the colonial period. To the west, you have the Susquehanna River, which was an effective barrier for many years. And then north of where we're currently located, above the Cornwall Furnace, is that large valley, which was subsequently named Lebanon Valley, or the Great Valley. Of course, it wasn't named Lebanon Valley in 1745 because Lebanon did not exist. That valley extends from South Mountain, which is the range right here in Cornwall, and then across the valley to the first ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Mountain, just to the north of the valley. Other towns that were located nearby, of course, Ephrata, founded by Conrad Beissel in 1732, and the little community of Brickerville, or then known as Brickerstown, was just getting off the ground with Peter Bricker and his brother John beginning to coalesce a small community there. So it gives you the lay of the land. Now, I mentioned the first observer that we had. Fortunately for us, a Swedish observer, the Reverend Israel Akrelius, a Lutheran pastor from Sweden, visited Cornwall while he was serving here in the colonies in 1753. We're not sure when he was here. Was it in 1753? But we know that he, at the end of his service in the Americas, returned to Sweden and published a book. And that book was called The History of New Sweden. That's, of course, the English abridged translation of the title. Fortunately for us, Israel described colonial Pennsylvania in exquisite detail. And not only was he observing the churches and the people who were going to the churches, but he was making observations about the political environment and the historical evolution of the Americas, and what people ate and drank and how they moved from place to place and what they were wearing. And this is a reprint of his book. You can buy it on a variety of sources. But as you can see on the slide, while the original text was published in Swedish, of course, it was subsequently translated and then published by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1874. So that makes the translation over 100 years old. So it itself is also a historical reference. And if you're a member of Cornwall Furnace, you may have just received your newsletter. And on the cover of that newsletter, a look at Colonial Cornwall, there's a picture, just like you see on your screen, of Israel Akrelius. So thanks to Mike Trump and the Ledger team for getting that out, because it's a nice compliment to what you'll be hearing tonight in my presentation. Now, turning to the broader picture of the lay of the land in the colonial period, this is a map by Lewis Evans. He published it in about 1749. I show on the map, he didn't use those wild colors, that's me, different towns and cities that were located here in Pennsylvania, including Philadelphia, the yellow dot that you can see down there on the Delaware River, and other towns, including Lancaster, the green dot, Reading, Cornwall, where we're presently located, York, and Bethlehem. So Acrelius described these towns in 1753. He said Philadelphia was about 2,300 households. So that meant the population of Philadelphia in that year was anywhere from 8 to 10,000 people. A pretty sizable city here in the colonies. Lancaster, in contrast, was about a fifth of that size, about 500 households. And Acrelius noted that the people who lived in Lancaster were primarily German. And that was the same for the people who lived in York and the people who lived in the new town of Reading, as well as the people who were living in Bethlehem. Now, of course, Bethlehem at this time was a Moravian community, so there were few houses, but the houses that were there were large dormitory-style houses. They were built out of stone, and they looked, you might imagine, like the dormitory you see today at the Ephrata Cloister, right down Route 322. So while they were few, they were also much larger, so they could have more residents. And then Carlisle was also described by Acrelius as having a few houses, but he noted in particular that the people in Carlisle tended to be Irish and Scots-Irish, not the German descent, which most of the other people that he mentioned were. This is what the land, we think, looked like in Cornwall, smack dab in the middle of that illustration. You're probably familiar with this illustration from down in your lobby, where the original, or I think an original, is located. In the middle of that diagram is Cornwall Furnace. You can see little puffs of smoke coming out of the iron furnace stack. To the right of this furnace, you can see the coal house or the charcoal barn. Above that, you can see the home of Colonel Curtis Grubb, built in 1772 during the colonial period, just towards the end of that. And then along that path from the furnace to the manor house is, of course, Furnace Creek. Which flows off in the upper northwest quadrant towards a grist mill. And the grist mill is just off of this illustration. Mining was occurring to the south of the furnace. You can see the large excavation there is Big Hill. The smaller excavation in between is Middle Hill. And then just scratching the surface to the west is Grassy Hill. So this is what... Excuse me. This is what we think the land looked like here in the colonial period. This from an illustration that was made for Robert Coleman about 1790, but it really didn't change much over those years. And so this gives us a pretty good depiction of what the colonial land looked like. Now, if you counted all the houses on this diagram, and excluded the ironmaster's mansion, you'd come up with about 20 structures that people were living in. So, of course, not all the houses that the workers were working or living in are on this diagram, on this picture, but it gives you an idea, again, about the relative size and scale of Cornwall during the colonial period. One thing you would note in particular are the trees in colonial Cornwall. When the colonists first came to Pennsylvania in the 1680s, or so, over 90%, well over 90% of Pennsylvania was covered with forests. And Acrelius knew his tree species. So he listed all of the trees that he identified here in Pennsylvania: white oak, black oak, Spanish oak, red oak, as well as black walnut, hickory, chestnut, poplar, sassafras, on and on and on. He was a little bit disappointed that the settlers with whom he interacted could not properly identify these trees. He, a man of learning and academia, thought, you know, if you're going to live here, you should know what these trees are. The people. Most of the people who were living down around Philadelphia and the outskirts of Philadelphia were English and Welsh. Most of the people in the countryside of Pennsylvania were Scots, Irish, and German. There were enslaved Africans here as well as African Americans, the distinction being the African Americans were actually born here in the Americas. They were not brought here against their wishes from Africa. There were also indentured servants. Excuse me, men and women who could not afford the transit across the Atlantic, but wanted to leave Europe and come to the Americas. And so when they arrived here in the Americas, they signed an agreement to work for somebody or some firm for a designated period of time, typically 3 to 4 years, so that they could earn back the cost of their transit across the Atlantic and at the same time acquire a trade. So in that way, it was a win-win from that perspective. There were also French people here, as well as Native Americans. And Acrelius described the people who he encountered at the furnaces, excuse me, as being partly English and Irish with a few Germans. So he wasn't just specifically talking about Cornwall, but the same group of people were located and working here at Cornwall at the time. In Cornwall, throughout the colonial period, it of course grew during that period, but during that period, it was roughly 30 to 50 households. There were tens of enslaved and indentured workers here in Cornwall. The iron masters lived like barons because, of course, people sought their employment from the iron masters, but the people also expected in the community that they would receive services from those iron masters. And the iron masters needed to deliver, so they brought in and sold goods at their stores, which the local people wanted. Average life expectancy was not too great at the time, about 36 years. There's a variety of estimates of this from a variety of medical sources, but this seems to be a prevalent estimate. Of course, infant and maternal mortality were taking a large impact on the age of the population. And early childhood diseases also contributed a lot to early deaths of the people. There were few doctors who were classically and academically qualified. And during the colonial period, the population of Pennsylvania grew significantly, primarily with the immigration of the German and the Scots-Irish peoples. Other colonies were self-propagating, but here in Pennsylvania, the largest growth in the population was coming from the immigrants. Most of the people lived on farms. We here in Pennsylvania were known to have the best grain in the country, in America. The productivity, according to Acrelius, was not due to the soil, but more so, thanks, Bruce, more so because of the climate that we had here, northern temperate climate. Animal manure was applied frequently to the soil. That was to amend the nutrients in the soil. Most farms were on newly cleared land, so that frequent application of manure was necessary to maintain the fertility of that ground. The crops grown were grown in fields where the farmers were in such a hurry that they didn't always remove the stumps and the trees. So Acrelius noted as he passed through Pennsylvania numerous cases where in the middle of a large grain field was a large tree that was dead, wasn't growing any longer, but it was in the middle of the field. You can imagine the hassles associated with that with modern day farming. The wheat was the main crop, and the other crops grown for food included rye, corn, and buckwheat. They also grew flax to produce linen for their fabric. The farmers also grew potatoes and cabbages, and in the orchards, they grew abundant apples, cherries, and peaches. I was surprised in doing my research how some of the same varieties of apples that were grown by the colonists in Pennsylvania are still well-regarded species or varieties of apples, like the Vanderveer apple. I've never seen a Vanderveer apple in a store that I'm aware of, but if you can find them, those are supposed to be especially good, especially in the colonial Pennsylvania. Tobacco was grown primarily for domestic use. So most farmers had a little plot where they were growing tobacco, but they were just growing it for themselves. They weren't selling it as a cash crop. In terms of livestock, the farmers were raising cattle, milk cows, sheep, pigs, oxen, horses, and mules. Almost every household had a garden. And in the garden, they were growing vegetables, beets and parsnips, onions, radishes, Turkish beans. I'd never heard of Turkish beans, but apparently that's what they called them in the colonial period. They were either dried white beans or they were fresh green beans. Well, I've heard of green beans, but never heard them called Turkish beans. In addition, they grew red peppers, lettuce, both head lettuce and German lettuce, peas, and sugar peas. They also grew herbs like parsley, scurvy grass, peppergrass, sage, rosemary, thyme, and chives. The houses that were in town, now this doesn't apply to Cornwall per se, but most of the houses in town were surrounded by fences. And that surprised Acrelius because I've heard this from even more contemporary Europeans when they come to the colonies. They notice how many fences we have in America. The farms were, of course, located on streams to establish a reliable source of water. Houses were built out of sandstone, limestone, oak planks, and logs. In the upper right, you see a limestone house from York County from the colonial period, and the sketch to the lower right on the screen is the Iron Master's Mansion built by Curtis Grubb in 1772. The roofs were covered with cedar shingles. The walls were plastered as well as the ceilings. They got a whitewash typically once a year. Kitchen smoke, according to Acrelius, was universal. You couldn't go in a home without smelling the cooking fire. Windows tended to be double sashed, and so that promoted a need for the Cornwall furnace to produce sash weights. Woodwork had to be painted or else it would quickly rot. And while the furniture in most houses in the country was modest, they did have functional furniture like wooden tables, bureaus, cabinets, and chairs. How did they get from place to place? Mostly by walking. It's always puzzled me when you read stories about the Revolutionary War when the soldiers were done serving the Continentals. They just walked home, whether they were in Massachusetts or in South Carolina. I can't imagine just, okay, I'm done. I'm going to walk home now. Especially after, how emaciated many of them were due to the want of food, as well as shoes and clothing and so many other necessities. Most people could walk if they were fit about 2 to 3 miles per hour. If you wanted to step that up considerably, you needed a good horse. On a horse, you could go 6 to 7 miles per hour over a longer haul. Most of the freight was being hauled in wagons, and that included, of course, the world-famous Conestoga wagons. You see an illustration on the right. And a lot of freight was moved on the rivers and stream systems. This is a photo from the 1850s of a river arc or river arcs on the Susquehanna. But as you can see, that same low-lying arc was used back in the colonial period to move freight up and down the Susquehanna River. Clothing. Most country people tended to wear homespun. In the cities along the Atlantic border, the Atlantic coast, they could afford to wear finer cloths. But here in the country, they wore coarser fabrics. Calicos and cottons were very popular with the women for their dresses during the summer. Linen was the preferred fabric for men during the warmer months. Both sexes preferred wool during the winter cool months. Satin was used widely as a highlight on dresses and other pieces of clothing. And Acrelius said, I can determine the origin of the people of Irish and German descent based on what they were wearing. I don't know how, he didn't elaborate on that, but somehow he knew. What were they eating? Well, unlike in today's environment, meals did not vary much from day to day, week to week. Country breakfast or supper in the summertime might consist of cold milk and bread, rice or milk pudding, cheese, butter, and cold meat like a smoked beef or a dried beef. Winter months, that same breakfast and supper might be cornmeal mush. That sounds wonderful. Milk porridge, hominy and milk. Hominy being, of course, roast corn where the husk comes, or the hull comes off of the corn kernel. Country lunches were bigger, so the main meal of the day was typically at lunch. During the summer meal might consist of meat broth and bread, fresh meat like beef or mutton, pork, dried beef and bacon, cabbage, apples, potatoes, beans, root vegetables, mashed turnips, and squash. Sounds like a pretty big meal. In the winter months, that same lunch might be hominy soup with salted beef and bacon, pasties or little meat pies with lamb and chicken, or wheat or buckwheat flour pancakes. Bread was baked at least weekly in most homes, and it was typically made in a large loaf, as large as could be made in the oven, using wheat flour. Rye flour, Acrelius observed, was seldom used. This kind of surprised me, given the prominence of the Germans in rural Pennsylvania, but this was his observation. Country flour was definitely darker and more coarse than the flour that was purchased in town. Meat dishes were often served surrounded by cooked cabbage, potatoes, root vegetables. An ordinary meal might consist of simply a fruit pie, like an apple pie or a cherry pie, served with cheese and butter. And liquid chocolate was often served in a water base with meals, and they used raw sugar, muscovado, to sweeten that chocolate. Not milk, but water. Now, Acrelius was especially surprised with the limited amount of fish and fish soup and salted dried fish that the Americans were consuming at the time. Of course, he came from Sweden, where seafood is much more prominent in the local diet. But for whatever reason, now our records at Cornwall do attest to the import of rockfish and herring and other migrational fish to Cornwall, where the people were eating it. So we know at least some of the workers at the furnace were eating fish. What did they drink? Cider was the most common drink of the people. In fact, William Penn, in his 1681 recruiting pamphlet that he sent over to Europe and had translated into multiple languages, featured the ready availability of cider in his colony. Beer. Acrelius described the beer as dark, thick, and unpalatable. I'm glad we've made some progress there. The colonists drank rum with just about anything. So whether it was raw eggs or old wine or bad milk, if you could mix rum with it, they would drink it. They were drinking mead in small quantities. Of course, mead is fermented honey and water. If you could afford wine, Madeira was the preferred wine. And we know that from some of the founders and their habits of consuming Madeira. Distilled beverages included brandy made from apple, cherry, and pear, although pears were not that prevalent back then, and also whiskey made from excess grain. The farmers would, at the end of the season, if they weren't using their grain, they would convert it into whiskey. Also tea, coffee, and chocolate. And last but not least is water. You couldn't always trust the water. Now, let's turn our focus to the furnace. This is an illustration of Cornwall Furnace from, again, about 1790 in the upper right-hand corner. And in that lower right-hand corner, you can see a picture of the charging room at the furnace today. Isn't that an inviting setting? Cornwall Furnace was built by Peter Grubb in 1742. The furnace typically employed 20 to 30 men. It operated 24 hours a day most of the year, and that being about 9 months out of the year in the colonial period. Later, they found ways to extend the blast operation. On a typical week, they would produce 20 to 24 tons of pig iron. Pig iron being those 38, 39-inch ingots of iron that were the primary product of Cornwall Furnace. In addition to the pig iron, they were also producing cast iron items like stove plates, pots, weights, like those sash weights I mentioned, forge plates for the use in the forges, and other cast iron items. And the worker titles included founder. The founder was the person who was overall responsible for the operation of the furnace, the supervisor. Molders, who were assisting in casting the cast iron items. Guttermen, who helped the founder down in the casting room. Fillers, whose job it was to put the raw stock into the furnace, the charcoal, the limestone, and the iron ore. Keepers, whose job it was to keep the furnace in good condition. And banksmen, who were busy moving iron ore around and limestone to support the operation of the furnace. Now, in addition to the furnace, Peter Grubb also built the Hopewell forges. Those forges were substantially complete by 1742, both a finery forge and a chafery forge. And they were located, as I mentioned previously, about 4 miles to the southeast of Cornwall on the small stream that today is known as Hammer Creek. It got its name because of the prevalence of the forges and the trip hammers along that creek. Because not only did you have Hopewell forges, but you also had Speedwell forge immediately downstream. So there was a lot of pounding going on. An early historian from the 20th century told the story from his father about how his father could hear those hammers in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, on Hammer Creek. The forges employed a smaller cadre of workers, typically 10 to 20 workers. The forges operated throughout the day. They did not operate all day long and all night long. And they operated most months out of the year, particularly when there was a heavy demand for wrought iron, which is what they were producing. They produced about 4 tons of wrought iron a week. So they took about 1/6 of the output from Cornwall Furnace and converted that from cast iron or pig iron into wrought iron, a very valuable metal. The finery forge was the first forge where the pig iron would go to, and that's where they converted the pig iron into wrought iron, and then that wrought iron was subsequently reshaped at the chafery forge. So the workers who were working in the forge were the finers, the people working in the finery forge, hammermen who worked in both forges, and then the laborers, who were the people getting the charcoal, moving the iron around, loading the carts, unloading the carts, doing all the things that labor is needed. Cornwall mines. Mining commenced about 1737. Of the three types of activities, they employed the fewest workers. Bless you. So about 10 men could mine enough ore to supply three furnaces. The three furnaces primarily being Cornwall Furnace and Elizabeth Furnace to the southeast. Not only were they producing 80 tons of ore a week, but they also needed to select the preferred ore, the better graded or better valued ore, and they needed to reduce the size of the ore. If it was coming out of the mine in a boulder, they had to reduce the size down to about the size of a man's fist to feed into the furnace so that the furnace would work properly. The worker titles included the master miner, basically the superintendent, other miners who were producing the ore, mine setters whose job it was to drill holes and blast, as well as support walls and overhead tunnels with wood, pounders whose job it was to pound on the ore all day long and break it down from the large boulders into the smaller sizes, and then banksmen whose job it was to move the ore and the limestone around as part of the mining operation. Now, all three of these operations, the mines, the forges, the furnaces, were also supported by additional workers, the woodsmen out in the forest who were chopping down the trees, the colliers who were making the charcoal out of that wood, blacksmiths who were making and repairing tools or putting horseshoes on horses, farmers who were raising crops, as well as clerks who were keeping track of all this material that was being sold and traded. Turning a little bit to the timeline of the furnace during the colonial period, of course, Peter Grubb owned and operated the furnace, the forges, and the mine, 1742 to 1745. In 1745, he leased the furnace and the forges to a company called the Cornwall Company. We'll talk about that in a moment. That was a 20-year lease, so it ended in about 1765, 1766. There was about a year transition there at the end of the lease period. During that period, Peter Grubb, the man who founded the furnace and the forges and the mines, passed away in 1754. And so by the time the lease expired, it was the sons of Peter Grubb, Curtis and Peter Grubb, who now owned and operated the furnace, the forges, and the mines. Curtis primarily focused his attention on the furnace, and Peter, the son of Peter, served as the ironmaster for the forges. And towards the end of the colonial period, Peter and Curtis both got active supporting the independence cause and took on officer positions, serving as Curtis served as the colonel of the 2nd Battalion of the Pennsylvania Associators, and Peter served as the colonel of the 8th Battalion in support of the Pennsylvania militia. Cornwall Company, I mentioned this a moment ago. This is probably, for some of you, might be the first time you've heard about the Cornwall Company. What's that? These are the men who leased the furnace for a period of 20 years, 1745 to 1765. At least those who started out in 1745 under the lease. They had 12 equal partners in the Cornwall Company. And not to dwell on this in any great extent, but just so you get an idea of how did these people come together. The common element to the company, these men had money that they needed to invest in something, and they invested it in the Cornwall Company so that the company could continue to operate. John Crosby and his son, John Crosby Jr., were associated with the Crum Creek Forge down in southern Chester County, northern Delaware County. Peter Dix was their partner on the Crum Creek Forge, and then later Peter got involved in some other iron-making operations. Daniel Walker was an early partner. He was responsible for the operation of the Mount Joy Forge and Forges, which were later named Valley Forge. And that's, of course, where Washington overwintered in 1777, 1778 with the Continental Army. Jacob Carter and John Pennell were both Quakers. As far as I could tell from doing some limited research, neither of them had a iron-making background, but John Pennell at least was the neighbor of Peter Dix. So at some point he sold property to the Dix family. George Churchman was a Quaker, and he was also a surveyor. So he would have been familiar with these areas from his surveying business. Samuel Grubb was, of course, the brother of Peter Grubb, so he knew all about Cornwall. And he was a stonemason, I believe, by training, like Peter was. Caleb Pierce was a justice of the peace. Couldn't find any linkage to iron works, but he did help to establish Lancaster, the town of Lancaster, and he was one of the three men who selected the location of the courthouse in Lancaster. So, and he had money, obviously. Peter Worrell was a member of the Provincial Assembly, served on a committee with Benjamin Franklin. And then the last two were merchants out of Philadelphia, Ebenezer Curry and also John Wallace. So this is how the Cornwall Company began. And on the right of this screen, you can see a typical 5-plate jam stove. This is one of the products that was made at Cornwall, or this is like one of those products. This particular jam stove is on display at the Mercer Museum in Bucks County, but it's very much like we would expect the other 5-plate jam stoves made by Cornwall. Now, lest you think that in today's environment, businesses are acquired and gotten rid of very quickly, looks like the same thing was going on back here in the Cornwall Company. By 1750, those 12 initial partners had dwindled to 3. George Churchman, Peter Dix, and a new individual called Abraham Hare from Lancaster County. By November of 1750, George Churchman had talked Jacob Giles into investing money in the Cornwall Company. And to support that, he brought along with him Amos Garrett and Colonel John Hall from Maryland. You see, Jacob Giles was a prominent investor, landowner, in Maryland, in northern Maryland, close up along the border. And before they actually invested, they came to check out Cornwall. So they gave it a thumbs up, and they split their investment up 6 ways so that they were equal partners as of November 1750. That's when the tensions started. So Jacob Giles and Amos Garrett had some early tensions when Amos Garrett bought out Abraham Hare's share of the furnace, and then, unbeknownst to the other partners, purchased Topahawken Forge, which you may know as Charming Forge, nearby. The reason that's a bit mysterious is because Amos Garrett was now competing with himself or his own company because, of course, Topahawken Forge was making the same kind of product that Hopewell Forges were making. And he did it kind of in a clandestine way. So he didn't tell Jacob Giles what he was doing, and that didn't help the trusting relationship with Jacob Giles. George Churchman and Colonel John Hall then exited, and by 1753, we're back to 3 partners, Jacob Giles, Peter Dix, and Amos Garrett. And Amos was basically running the furnace at the time, as well as taking care of Topahawken Forge and doing a couple of other things. All throughout this period, it was challenging for the furnace and the forges to make enough money to pay their debts. because often the product that they were cranking out was being paid on debt, and it was difficult to claim that debt and get real money back for what you were owed. And so that meant a perpetual financial demand. And so during this period in 1753, 1754, Cornwall Furnace and the Hopewell Forges were worried that they may go under because people would come claiming their money and they would not be able to pay it. So they would become insolvent and would have to close down and sell out. Fortunately for us here today, you at Cornwall Manor, that didn't happen, and Cornwall Furnace went swimmingly along. Peter Dix then exited the partnership so that by June 1753, you were down to Jacob Giles and Amos Garrett. Jacob decided he wanted his sons to be partners in this operation, so he brought in John and Nathaniel Giles. So that meant you had 3 Gileses and a Garrett. Guess who left? Amos Garrett. So Jacob Giles made Amos Garrett an offer he couldn't refuse and acquired his debt, and Amos Garrett left, leaving the Cornwall Furnace and Hopewell Forges in the operation of the Giles family as of 1756. And with some minor perturbations, it kind of continued like that until the lease ended in 1765, 1766. But this is all part of that fascinating history associated with Cornwall. And before this, you really didn't get much exposure to this part of the history. So hopefully you'll walk away from us tonight learning something new. Now, that trade was well established. So, of course, the furnace and the forges were producing the cast iron, the bar iron, the cast products. They were selling it to the local neighbors, also to Topahakan, Quittapahilla Forge. They were selling it to remote places like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Heidelberg, now known as Schaefferstown, Ephrata. Some cast iron items went down to Ephrata, and Lebanon nearby. But because of the Maryland connection, they were also sending their cast iron and iron pigs down to the Chesapeake region to support forges down in northern Maryland, like Octorara Forge, Rock Run Forge, Cumberland Forge. They were also sending it to export towns like Charlestown and Baltimore. And from there, Cornwall Iron went on to the West Indies, as well as back to Europe through London. So they did actually export iron from Cornwall to London, England. Now, in return, of course, the iron masters were bringing back the goods that the local community, including their workers, wanted. Things like sugar, coffee, tea, fabrics, fish, tobacco, rum, books, and currency. All very vital to the viability of the Cornwall community. So you can see, we often talk about Cornwall plantation being this like self-sustaining community, but as you can see, it was really part of a much broader trade fabric that extended all the way back to the mother country in England. Turning briefly to the workers, on this chart, I've shown wages, the relative wages of the workers, beginning with the managers on the bottom, who were, of course, making the most money, all the way up to the top, focused on the enslaved workers as well as the indentured servants. I plotted these in the units of shillings per day so that you can make a fair comparison between what the laborers were earning, which was typically in shillings per day or shillings per week, and the managers, who, of course, were salaried and were making pounds per year, like 100 pounds per year. But when you do the math, this is the way it turns out. So the managers were making about 9 shillings per day, and this is a generalization. So there are exceptions to this, but this gives you an approximation of what were most of the people working based on the jobs that they were performing. The keeper, the man responsible for maintaining the furnace, was earning about 5 shillings per day, about half what the manager was making. Then you had the skilled artisans, the blacksmiths, the carpenters. They were making a little less. And then you had all the workers at the furnace, the forges, the mines, fillers, molders, colliers, miners, founders, guttermen, teamsters, hauling all this material around. The miller grinding the grain to make the flour so you can make the bread. Cooks and haymakers. Cooks and haymakers could be male or female. So this is the first that you see women show up in the worker roles at Cornwall Furnace. And then, of course, at the very bottom of the scale, the indentured servants, well, they weren't really getting paid while they were getting room and board, and they were learning a trade during the period of indenture. They weren't getting paid. And then the enslaved workers, of course, brought here against their will as enslaved workers. They sometimes got overpay if they produced more than what was expected of them, but you couldn't count on that in a routine basis. So we show them as not earning anything because that's probably more likely. So in 1776, the end of the colonial period, there were 44 workers listed in the Cornwall Furnace time book. You see a photo of that time book page for July. This is from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I know you can't read it, but let me just give you some of the highlights. William Payne was the manager, and he was, of course, salaried. There were 39 free laborers in July of 1776. These are people who are getting paid because they're not indentured and they're not enslaved. There were 5 enslaved workers. 3 were owned by Curtis Grubb in July of 1776, and 2 were being leased by the Cornwall Company. And one of the 2 was Negro Dick, who later became known as Governor Dick. And if you happen to catch Kathy Lindert's presentations at Mount Gretna Historical Society, she has another one coming up on March 21st at the Lebanon County Historical Society. You'll get a lot more about Governor Dick. But of course, Governor Dick is the man for whom the hill is named just outside of Mount Gretna. And so he's one of the more well-known enslaved workers here in the Cornwall community. Fewer workers were on the rolls during the winter months. The furnace wasn't as busy. The forges weren't as busy. The mines weren't as busy. But then during the summer months, the rolls ticked up, particularly during the summer harvest season when the workers included mowers, reapers, and haymakers. So just a little snapshot into life here in colonial Cornwall. So the period ended with Cornwall thriving by 1776. About 100 residents, give or take, in the community. The ironmasters, Curtis and Peter Grubb, were admired by the local citizens as industrial, political, and military leaders. Cornwall, in the initial phase of the Revolutionary War, supplied cannon, shot, shell, stoves, and salt pans to support the fight for independence. And nearby communities like Steightstown, or otherwise known today as Lebanon, and Heidelberg, otherwise known as Schaeferstown, were established. So not only did we have the local community to support and to support the labor, but also some growing communities in the immediate vicinity. So hopefully now you have a good orientation to colonial Cornwall. I wanted to share this with you so that you could use it throughout the rest of your lives, and particularly the rest of America 250 this year as we celebrate the semi-quincentennial. When you're watching those reenactors, when you're hearing talks, think about, what was that corn mush food like? What was the cider like that they were drinking? Was the beer really dark and unpalatable? It gives you some depth to your perception about colonial Cornwall. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mike. So we're going to go into our question and answer session now. We had 2 online questions, which we'll address first, and then we'll take the questions in the room, which is I think opposite than what I said earlier, sorry. So one question comes from Dan Snyder online. Were any of the Cornwall company owners successful with their share of ownership?
Okay, and I don't need to repeat the questions. Thanks, Dan. So yes, some of the owners of the original 12 were successful. In other words, they got back more money than they initially put into the company. But a lot, I think, were questionable whether they actually made money. If at least they could preserve the money that they invested in the company.
And Dan had another question related to the cooks. If they had cooks, were they providing meals for the workers and their families?
Thanks. So yes, the cooks were primarily serving food to the workers. There were a lot of single men who were working in the furnace and the forges. And so there were cooks both here at Cornwall and also down at the Hopewell forges. Typically, they weren't providing meals to the families because that would be a home responsibility. But as best we can tell from the records that I've looked at, they were cooking for the workers.
Okay, one more online question. How bald was the land from cutting down so many trees?
Good question. We have photographs well after the colonial period, and this area looks pretty sparse in terms of tree coverage. When they were harvesting the trees with the intent to produce charcoal, they typically did not clear cut the land. They coppiced the trees, so they left the root and trunk structure in place, and that allowed them to grow back the trees in 20 to 30 years so that they could reharvest the saplings that grew out of the trunks. That was much easier for them to then produce the charcoal because they didn't have to split the wood as much as they had when they harvested the virgin forests.
That's it.
Okay, questions here, sir?
You mentioned in the first slide that Peter Grubb, quote, acquired the land. Did he buy it directly from William Penn or his sons or a proprietary company?
Yeah, so
Penn had to figure out how to sell all that land that he acquired.
Right. So the question is, how did Peter Grubb acquire the land? Did he buy it from the Penns or did he buy it from somebody else? He actually bought it from land speculators, Joseph Turner, William Allen, whose names you may be familiar with, William Allen as in Allentown. Joseph Turner and William Allen were both involved in the Durham furnace. They were land speculators, so they got large tracts of land, like thousands of acres of land. And so Peter acquired his land from those two gentlemen. Yes.
You mentioned the furnace ran for 9 months. Why not have it for 12? And what were the 3 months that they did?
Okay. So the question is, the furnace operating for about 9 months out of the year, why didn't they run it for 12 months? And what were they doing with the furnace during the 3 months that it wasn't operating? Part of the constraint that they were operating under in the colonial period was the water source. So in the summertime, the little stream that supplied the water for the water wheel would dry up during dry spells. And if you didn't have moving water, you couldn't operate your furnace. And then in the wintertime, that same source of water would freeze. And so if it wasn't moving water, you couldn't operate your furnace. So that contributed to the amount of downtime. Now, when they were closed and not in blast, so to speak, varied seasonally based on, was it a harsh, dry summer or was it a pretty wet summer? Was it a cold winter? Or was it a moderate winter? So that 9 months is an average. They did have to shut down at least some point in the year because they had to reline the lining of the furnace, and they also had to rebuild the hearth at the base of the furnace. And so that would typically take, depending on how extensively they were working those actions, anywhere from 2 weeks to a month to perform. And then sometimes the furnace just didn't cooperate. So they might return it to blast. It might operate for a month or so, and then the walls would collapse. The inner walls, the in walls, they called them, would collapse. And so they'd have to shut down and restart. So it was their downtime was precipitated by a variety of different causes. And then on average, during the colonial period, from 1742 to 1776, and that's where you get the 9 months. And that's based on fact. That's based on the blast books that they kept at the furnace. So we know when the furnace was up and running and when it was not working. Other questions? Comments? Mike Emery.
Can you talk a little bit about how furnace interacted with people that were living kind of around? These other local landowners and
Wow. Well, that could probably be a whole talk in and of itself. So Mike's question in summary form is, what was going on between the landowners around the furnace in the middle part of the colonial period and the furnace? Was the furnace living here in isolation of all that? Absolutely not. And so the furnace was part of the community. And so those local landowners were selling their wood to be converted into charcoal to support the operation of the furnace. Those landowners were buying supplies from the store because they were bringing in goods that were needed by the local community that were not otherwise available. There was no Amazon. You couldn't go to the internet and order it and have it delivered the next day. So you had to rely on what goods were being sold nearby. And candidly, comparing what was being sold at this set of stores here in Cornwall to what was being sold in other stores, I think the people in Cornwall were pretty well off when it came to having access to a wide variety of desirable goods. And that's not just foodstuffs and fabric, but it's also gunpowder and flints and steel and all the many things that the local residents, even if you weren't working here at the furnace, you would still want and need books, Bibles, cheese, chocolate. All these things were available to them as part of the community. Is that kind of what you were looking for?
In kind of a follow-up question, if you hit on that store, would you say that was kind of the way that because the sugar is coming from the Caribbean and chocolate's coming from South America. Well,
yeah, so Mike's extension of my answer is that a way through the store that the local community got access to the broader worldwide sourcing? Because, of course, the chocolate was coming from South America. The sugar was coming from the Caribbean. Yes. Yeah. The rockfish was coming from the forges down in Maryland. The tobacco was coming from the forges in Maryland. The salt was being brought up from the salt marshes down in Maryland. So there was a lot of trade back and forth. Yes.
where was the store?
Oh, where was the store? I don't know actually where the store was located during the colonial period. The stores that I'm familiar with in Cornwall existed in towns and villages that came along much later than the colonial period. If I had to guess, they had a building that they referred to as the office here on the grounds somewhere. It was a wood frame structure. And so that may have been used as the store. I don't know, Lydia or Mike, whether you know.
The only thing I would say is that clerks keeping records.
Which would have been in the office. Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So Mike was saying that the clerks would have been the same people operating the stores, and the clerks, of course, would have been located in the office. But we don't know. I have not seen any map of, I don't see it on that diagram from 1790. Now, I may be seeing a structure, but I don't recognize it as the office. I just have a reference to the office from inventories that were prepared at the end of people's lives when they were coming up with their total goods and chattels. Back there?
Local people then would be families traveling around.
Yeah.
Oh, what was the point of the local travel getting around?
Yeah, so the question is, how were the local people getting around back during the colonial period? They didn't have cars, they didn't have gasoline. They walked, and if they needed to go far and they needed to go fast, they would either have to use a horse that they had or they'd have to borrow a horse. Sometimes they could have hitched rides on wagons. With all this trade going on, that meant that there was a well-established transportation network taking pig iron down to the Hopewell Forge, bringing in hay and straw from the fields, serving grain to the mill, and then bringing the flour from the mill back to the store. So my guess, and it's just that, is that people figured those things out. If they couldn't walk, they found a way to get a ride or hitch a ride on a wagon. Yep.
If I were to look at now, what would I say?
Oh, so his question is, if he were to go to Cornwall Furnace now, what would he see on the tour? It would be amazing. No, Cornwall Furnace is one of the best preserved cold blast charcoal fueled furnaces in the world. So the tour includes typically a 15-minute overview video that's provided in our visitor center. And that gives you a summary of the history of the furnace and the community and the mines. And then we take you on a guided tour of the furnace. So we start in the charging room where the fillers were feeding the stock into the furnace. We then take you down into the wheel room. The wheel room was the source of power for the air blast into the furnace. And then through the copper room, a copper room is where they were processing copper ore, which they were also extracting from the mines next door. And then through the engine room, while during the colonial period, the furnace was supported by a water wheel, later, beginning in 1841, they installed a steam engine as a reliable source of power for the blast for the furnace. And then from there, we take you down to the casting room, and it's in the casting room that they cast the iron pigs, as well as all the other cast iron items. And we do all that with a riveting narrative so that our guests are quite entertained and informed by the time they're done with their tours. Does that answer your question? Okay, sir.
What is the government, any government structure going on during the time of the statutory legal system? Services,
Wow. Yeah, that's a long, that's a long question. So this question is, what government existed back then during the colonial period? And we think of today the three branches of government: the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. You had all three back then. The names of the bodies might be different. The names of the courts might be different. But they weren't functioning under the U.S. Constitution, of course, because that came along much later. But they were operating under colonial law that was established by the British. And one of the unique things with Pennsylvania is that we had a charter, and that enabled William Penn to formulate the government the way he thought it should be established. So really, what he set in place and then iterated several times became the foundation for the Pennsylvania Constitution. And then major elements of the Pennsylvania Constitution become absorbed by the U.S. Constitution. So we had courts, we had constabularies, we had land registration process. Okay.
Two more questions came online, so we'll address those, and then maybe two more questions here in the audience, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up for the evening. The first question was from Henry. What was the average wage for the workers? Were they paid in English coin?
Yeah. So average wage, if you go back to that chart that I showed, most of the workers are down in that 2 to 3 shillings per day range. So not a lot. And they were paid in Pennsylvania currency, but it was in the same pound, shilling, pence nomenclature that we're familiar with from England.
And then Gordon asked, did the owners interact or do business with the DuPonts of Delaware?
Oh. No. Not as far as I know. I think the DuPonts came along much later in history. There was a question back there.
Shillings. Well, let's find out about it. When was it? When was it converted from shillings to English money?
Yeah, so the question is, when did we go from English pound sterling to Pennsylvania pounds and then to dollars and cents? I don't know when we made the first transition to Pennsylvania currency. I want to say that was probably back around 1700 or something like that. And then the dollar became the coin of the realm here in the United States after the passage of the U.S. Constitution. So about 1790 or so, the dollar was established as U.S. currency, but it took a while for that money to be phased in. So we have records from Cornwall that are in the 1810s, 1814 time frame, and they're still reporting expenses in pounds, shillings, and pence. So it's a long time.
Final question. Who's it going to be?
No pressure. What do we know about the actual interaction between, daily interaction, say, between the colonials here and all of
Yeah, so the question is, what was the relationship between the indigenous people, the Native Americans that lived here, and the settlers? We don't know. I don't know. There's not a lot of history on that. As best I can tell, by the time Peter Grubb was acquiring the property here in Cornwall, and Cornwall was becoming a community, the Native Americans were no longer living very close by. One of the unique things with William Penn in Penn's colony was he felt strongly that the Native Americans should be compensated for any land that was used by the settlers. Of course, there's all kind of debate about whether the Native Americans really understood that, because that was not part of their society. You know, they used land when they needed to hunt animals and grow crops. And they didn't have the same concept of possession of the land like the settlers came with. There were rumors about Peter Grubb negotiating some sort of treaty with the Native Americans, but as best I can tell, and other historians, there's nothing to that, because that would have been illegal for Peter Grubb to have done that. Okay. Yep.
All right, everybody, let's give Mike Weber a round of applause. Thank you. So I've got some closing remarks and announcements for you. First of all, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're especially grateful to Mike Weber for his wonderful presentation. And I also want to recognize our team who's working behind the scenes tonight, Kathy Donaldson, Bruce Chadbourne, Lydia Jones, and Karen Mitchell, who are helping organize our virtual talk. Many thanks to the Friends of Cornwall Iron Furnace, who generously supported this program through sponsorship, and to Cornwall Manor, of course, for allowing us to use this wonderful space. Again, if you appreciate our lecture series, please consider a gift of support to advance our mission and keep this beloved educational program free for everyone to attend. We have a collection basket in the back for those of you who are with us here in person, and then look for that link to our donation page in the chat. Our next full-length lecture, titled Digging Deeper into the Hessian Ditch, will be presented by Dan Snyder on Tuesday, April 14th at 7 p.m. Same place here on April 14th, online or here at Freeman Hall. I say full-length because you are also invited to attend the many programs that we have coming up at the Furnace this spring, including our new mini lecture series, which is held in person on Sunday afternoons at 1:30 in the Visitor Center. These are 30-minute bite-sized lectures that are a condensed version of tonight's format, offering lessons on a variety of engaging topics, and those are also free to attend. So you can find full details on our website under the Events tab, and we also have some information on a rack card at the back of the room. We are also now accepting advanced reservations for our historic walking tours of the village of Anthracite, which is coming up on Saturday, April 18th. That'll be presented by L. Susan Wenzel and Mike Trump. You won't want to miss this very special experience to learn more about the generations of workers whose labor fueled Cornwall's industrial past and the places they called home. The tours run on the hour between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., each one culminating in a rare opportunity to tour the interior of a former miner's home. This program is $15 per person to attend and $10 for Friends of Cornwall Iron Furnace members. So get your membership and get a discount. Please call the museum to register.
They know that the local printed in our monthly bulletin.
The question was, can we get the local programs printed in Cornwall Manor's local bulletin? And the answer is absolutely yes. We work with your staff here at Cornwall Manor to list our upcoming programs so that you'll see them in the booklet.
Good. This one wasn't everything.
It was towards the back. Yeah, it was listed this month toward the back, but we're going to work very hard with Stacia and her team to make sure that you have plenty of information and notice ahead of time. Thank you for asking. The last thing I'll mention is be sure to save the date for our spring open house, which is coming up on Saturday, May 2nd, which will feature the return of cast iron cooking, a variety of living history demonstrations, our guided furnace tours, of course, shopping opportunities, and more. Full program details will be released very soon. And then finally, just a friendly reminder that the museum is open Friday through Sunday for guided furnace tours. You got to hear a little bit about what you can expect when you come to visit us. So please check our website for details and tour information at cornwallironfurnace.org, or you are welcome to call us at the Museum Visitor Center. Thanks again for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you at Cornwall Iron Furnace very soon.